Imagine standing up against a school bully or a snobbish colleague, not with your fists, but with your brain and bravery. Well, that's all what you'll find in this book, At the Pleasure of His Majesty, which narrates a true story of an Indian who legally challenged the crown. And guess what? He won. We'll be taking you through all his legal battles, his life experiences, and all of the courtroom drama through the words of his grandson, who also happens to be the author of this book. Mr. Chander Lall, thank you so much for speaking to us.
Thank you very much for having me on your show.
So, sir, how has your personal connection to your grandfather and your father led to you exploring this narrative, especially in this book? Were there any hands-down experiences that sparked a particular, anticipation to cover and talk about this significant event in your life?
There were two trigger points, I'd say. My father was a great storyteller, and we grew up hearing stories of his escapades and his father's escapades. So that kind of went into the grain. Then when I joined the profession, and I hadn't paid much attention to the case, we were told there was a famous Privy Council case. I joined the profession, and we were intellectual property lawyers, and therefore service law was not something that we covered. But when I started walking down the corridors, a young man whose name was Lall, quite a few people practicing service law said, "You are I am Lall's grandson." I said, "Yes, and proud to be." And he says, "Well, your grandfather's case is a very famous case, which is the base case for service law." Right. So I said, "Gosh, this sounds interesting." And you won't believe it. For the longest time, I didn't read that case. And finally, I told my dad, I said, "I've heard enough of the story. High time that now that I'm a lawyer and I'm interested in the subject, let me read the case." So I pulled it out of the AIR manual in 1948 and read it, and I was hooked and got very busy with work. It should have been done a lot earlier. I wish my father was alive when I'd done this. He would have been very proud, and I would have made a better product, because then I would have had him live. Thankfully, there was a journalist who had recorded his sort of stories, an American journalist, on tape. And I called her in San Francisco and said, "Would you be willing to share that with me?" And she converted those into digital format and sent it to me. So I heard those stories and then decided to write the book. And it took me many years.
While you were going through those stories and some of the case files, were there things that surprised you, events that intrigued more of your interest in the situation?
Well, the case itself is very telling. Yeah. But then you can't write a 180-page book on the few stories that you hear, or a case which is already reported. So what was interesting and what was challenging was that I needed to see what was contemporaneously happening in the country and putting that in perspective. What event happened and what was the state of the country at that time. Partition was, of course, a substantial area where, when my grandfather was in England, over partition he had to be in England, and the whole family was in Lahore. And my father was all of 18. And how they stayed awake all night to keep away, and they were Muhammad Ali Jinnah Zindabad, and you know what the situation then was, and it was scary according to his narrations. And my grandmother refused to leave initially. Our very good friends, Mr. SSP Bindra, was the neighbor, and he said, "Look, I know what's going to happen. I need to move you. You're my responsibility." My grandmother would have none of it. She says, "No, I'm not going to agree to go. My husband's gone there." And then they lost a daughter. She had an appendix burst. Couldn't move her to give her medical attention. And then she wanted to make her do her last rites, and it's fascinating how the last rites were. You couldn't take a body now for cremation, right? Because you're Hindu then, you're disclosing yourself. So it was done in a surreptitious manner. Very challenging and a very exciting story, and I was convinced that this is a story that had to be told.
Right, indeed, it is a challenging and very convincing story. But now let's talk about the I am Lall case versus the Crown, okay? Now, Privy Council's 1948 verdict marked a historic moment in the triumph, especially when it comes down to laying down the fundamental groundwork for the legal structure pertinent to the Indian civil services. Now, how do you think the struggle of your grandfather led to the evolution of Article 311?
So, again, seeing the backdrop, there were like 9 kids that he had. You're thrown out of service. As an ICS officer, you're a king. Right. You're home, you have a massive house. I still remember we have a carpet which wouldn't even fit in our drawing room. That my grandmom used to say used to be a small piece in our drawing room. So you're living this royal life, and suddenly it's taken away from you. Now your income disappears. You had a grand income of 350 rupees at that time. That's taken away from you. And then you're fighting the crown at the peak of its, well, I won't say it's at the peak because the last 10 years they were on a decline with Mahatma Gandhi's movement, Nehru and the Indian National Congress really pushing hard for self-rule, etc. So they were on a decline, but still powerful and being fairly sort of malignant towards people. And you are their employee. You're deployed and employed by them, and hence, at the pleasure of His Majesty, you're hired at his pleasure, and you would be fired at his pleasure. So what is fascinating in the story is that he still chose to take that on and fight because I think he wanted his name absolved. I know the Lall trait now, and more than anything else, what was important to him was that I have been wronged and I must not be wronged. And I read his petition, and it actually reads to say, this is not about me. This is about victimization of His Majesty's civil servants who are here to serve you, but you cannot do this to them. And this, I will set an example for all civil servants to come about doing that. I'm not going to say the 311 was entirely based on that, but this became the base case, and I think this created awareness of how civil service and civil servants would have to be, who are currently at the pleasure of the president, are entitled to due process of law, which they must be given, and they must be given the fullest opportunity, and that's how a democracy must work.
Right. But do you think those principles, those changes, those evolution, or the entire groundwork laid for the Article 311 to come into existence by your grandfather, do they still hold significance in the modern and contemporary legal structures?
Absolutely. Absolutely, because it's about your promotions, your demotions, your removal from service, and how you're entitled to a proper trial. So it's about the judicial system also available, the fairness of the judicial system and due process available to civil servants who may be at the pleasure of the president, but doesn't mean that they're civil servants, but doesn't mean make them what, as we understand, servants, and they are entitled to due process. So I think it's a huge narrative for good people to join civil services because of Article 311.
Do you think we are still reeling under the colonial hangover in our judicial system?
Let me tell you, colonial hangover is one thing, but the colonial system and their legal system was way and far above any other legal system at the time. So we are very privileged to have had that legal system. I'm not sure if I haven't lived those times, but I'm not sure if the legal system today is, we may have deteriorated it a bit. I hope that's not true. But it certainly has very good areas which we have adopted in our Code of Civil Procedure, in our Constitution. We've taken from the American Constitution. So we've taken the best of all around the world.
But you feel there's still room for improvement here?
I think there's room for improvement on implementation. On implementation, and laws are being tweaked to make them more current. Right. But implementation is a challenge. But having said that, it's still very efficient, and I think I'm proud to be part of this system even today.
Right. Okay. You've time and again talked about pivotal moments, events that happened during your grandfather's life or your father's life, like the Gora War, the First World War, his participation in the First World War, or the Siege of Kut and the partition of India. How did these inform your grandfather's approach to the legal case that he was actually fighting? So,
look where he's coming from. He hails from a small town called Miawali. Imran Khan comes from there. That's the claim to fame now. His job, it was about 5,000 people village. His job was to feed the bovine, the cows. Right. And he got fed up and he said, this is not my life. This is not what I'm made for. Ran away from home, educated himself. Then got an opportunity to go to the First World War because the Brits said whoever wins and survives the First World War, they wanted soldiers to go on the front and to educated people. And then he lands up in Mesopotamia, where 70% of the troops are killed in the siege of Kut al-Khaimah in Mesopotamia. He survives, I don't know how. And then he comes out, goes to England, takes an exam for ICS, passes it, and joins the profession. So he's coming from a backdrop of, I believe if you fought a war and fought such a vicious war where you've lost 70% of your fellow soldiers, it gives you a certain character which will, I'm sure, reflected in what he was able to give him the courage to do what he was doing. If you can go to a First World War and fight the Germans, what are the Brits as your employers on a employment matter, right? That becomes, sounds very, comparatively very petty. So I'm sure that developed his will for fight. He had the most amazing willpower. I still remember the doctors giving him, when he was unwell and I was very young, he would be given sedatives too because he was in pain. And he would be awake. And then his friend, Dr. Sopti, who was a very good friend, would say, Lal Saab, chhod do. And pop, off he went. So off he went as in just in coma, not in just it worked. But otherwise, if he didn't want any medication to work, he had willpower enough to ensure that it did not work. So he had a very powerful willpower, and therefore he was able to fight this case, I think, for a larger good, because his petition categorically, when I read the papers in the Privy Council, it categorically read that this is something which has far greater significance. And that's why the case of court of first instance was a division bench of the Lahore High Court, not a single judge or the district court, which is where normally courts of first instance. So it was a division bench, then the federal court, and finally the Privy Council. He won on all three.
All three, yes. Okay, beyond the courtroom drama, your book has also shed some light on the personal journey, especially when your family moved back to India, real life adventures of your family during the partition. Did your father's experiences or your grandfather's experiences during these challenging times shape up the entire fight in this, basically the legal battle, or how has that significantly impacted your life?
I think I started believing in the gene pool. I think there is a gene pool. Once you read this book on my father, I think he was nuts. He went back from Lahore to Amritsar several times. He was put in front of he was almost killed. His friends had to rescue him out of a police station where, they were sent off to say, he's a kafir, we are not going to let him go. We had certain Gandhara statues which he brought out from there. There were the whole household, a dining table, dining chairs. He brought all those back. And he used to go back, and his uncle had a whole bunch of cheese, craft cheese, which was lying in a place. They used to sell that cheese. And there were 4 friends called pals, Prem, Amar, Liaquat, and Sadiq. And they used to go and have a blast at a cafe. And this is just partition, right? There's deaths happening. He would go on his bicycle. He went to a college where he saw dead bodies. And in another case, the police opened fire on them, and he asked everybody to lie down flat so that the bullets go above him. So, I mean, his stories are absolutely fascinating. I'm like, Dad, where were you coming from? What were you thinking? So I think there is a gene pool. I think I have a little bit of that craziness. My father obviously got it. I think we'll blame it all on our grandfather.
That's very convenient, though. Okay, you conclude the book on a rather sad note when you are talking about the real life experiences and adventures of your family, especially when they reach back India and partition has already happened. The country has been divided into 2 parts. And let's talk about the treasures we couldn't win, especially after this battle, and things that we lost in spite winning this legal battle.
So it's a very bitter, sour victory.
Yes.
You lose a daughter when you come back. It still brings tears to my eyes to think of that. You've come back, your home's gone. You don't know what the state of your family is. You are now too senior in the ICS to be reinstated and do what? The new government has taken place. He was close to Vallabhbhai Patel, who was the deputy prime minister, and he said, look, I don't have a place for you, and you can't go back as district and session judge. So he created a post of chief claims commissioner. And I end on a somber note, but it is a proud note. It's him giving a speech, a valedictory speech at the Imperial Hotel, with the pillars of the mighty British behind him. Narrating to everybody that, it is not the pleasure of His Majesty which matters, but it is the majesty of the law that must prevail. So I think it's but it is not a victory which is to be celebrated. It is a victory which is to be appreciated, respected for what the man did, and in the bargain what he lost. I think he still would come back and sit when he sat in isolation. He probably thinks he lost more than he won. but he left something for the future generations to look to at a huge personal cost. Otherwise, he was in a private job. He could have moved his family with the help of the Bindras. He could have moved to, come back to India and look, maybe his daughter would have been alive. Who knows what could have happened? But he took it on. Of course, I'm sure, hindsight is 50-50. He didn't have knowledge of what was going to happen. We didn't have cell phones that time that, there's partition happening, come back. So communications were difficult. Look at the dedication of his wife who refused to move because her husband. So these are times which are different, a different era,
Okay. One takeaway for young readers from this book.
Well,
one piece of advice you'd like to give.
Well, I've had a pretty crazy youth. I've had a great, I was a bad student. I'm putting it right there. I'm a lawyer. I'm a reasonably successful lawyer. I think what reading can give you, it just opens up your mind. It was fascinating to hear those stories, but when I started reading and I had to read contemporaneous material, to put a page on a book, you have to read about 100 pages and then siphon out stuff and put it together at the same time. What happened? Where could he have been? And I had to recreate those instances. And that opens up a whole new field. When you go and look at the Qutub Minar or you look at a monument and you've read about it, you're seeing a different picture.
There's altogether a different perspective.
A different perspective.
Yeah.
So reading, because knowledge, there's so much knowledge out there. And until and unless you acquire that knowledge, it's a building or it's a human. My grandfather was just I am Lall. If I'm able to write about him and people are able to read about him, he becomes I am Mal and the case that shook the crown. So it changes perspectives, it changes people, it changes a building, it changes your perspective towards life, your outlook towards life. So I would strongly urge kids to read, and it's fun. It's like reading stories. Yeah, I understand there's television, there's your internet, but reading has its own charm.
I agree.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chander Lall, for speaking to us and taking out the time and
Thank
talking
you
about
very
your
much,
book.
and this means a lot to me and my family that you're covering this, and I thank you from the bottom of my heart on behalf of my entire family who has been through this, not been through the experience, but have felt it and experienced it at different levels through different. So thank you for inviting me.
Pleasure was all ours. This is a story that needs to be told, I believe. So thank you so much.
I sure hope people enjoy it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.